Hey everybody, in this video we're going to be talking about Stephen King's behemoth 2011 historical fiction novel 11/22/63. We'll be showing you the points to look for when trying to identify first US and first UK trade editions, as well as provide some thoughts on the work itself. The first US trade hardcover edition was published by Scribner. There's the front newspaper, looks like newspaper article, and then the back, the alternate narrative. I'm a big fan of that. It's really cool because it's part of the American consciousness, I think, to sort of fixate on the Kennedy assassination and wonder what would have happened. And there you go, right on the front cover of the book. Inside the jacket, you want to look for a price of US $35. Under the jacket, red boards, black on the spine, kind of golden lettering on the spine, pretty good looking. And I look for the copyright page, as always with the Scribners, the handy dandy number line that includes the number 1. Like with all the Scribners, pretty straightforward, pretty easy to identify the first, but there it is, the first US trade hardcover of 11/22/63. I'm going to pass it over to Noah to take a look at the first UK.
All right, and now we have the British first trade hardcover edition of the book. Here it is. This was done by Hodder and Stoughton, the UK publisher of King's books, and what do we have? We have a printed price of $19.99 on the bottom of the flap there. The boards are just plain black, typical Hodder and Stoughton boards, not very interesting. And the end papers, I believe these are the same end papers as the US, I'm not sure though. And the copyright page will have that single 1 by itself right there to indicate a first printing. If you can you guys see that? And that's pretty much it. That's what the book looks like. There's the spine, there's the back of the jacket, and that is the UK first trade of 11/22.
So 11/22/63 shares something very important in common with Under the Dome, and that is that both stories had been percolating in Stephen King's brain for a long time. Since, he lived through the Kennedy assassination, and it was very vivid in his memory. So like most Americans from the time and in the decades since, the generations since, have thought about this and have wondered, what if things had worked out differently? And he had this idea of writing about it for decades. Under the Dome was another one where the idea had been percolating in his mind. He had started it, he had abandoned it when he was much younger because it was just too big. So the idea that it had been stewing for so long, and he finally felt ready and accomplished enough to tackle it. Oh man, nothing gets me more excited than reading something like that. 11/22/63, when Stephen King announced and he talked about the history and that he finally felt ready to do it, just the idea that he was truly reaching and striving and going for this big project that had been intimidating to him for so long. Just super excited to read the finished product. 11/22/63 is one that has tremendous crossover appeal. I think it's probably a Stephen King, pop culture late period classic, in the way that a lot of his newer books have sort of failed to break in broadly for one reason or another. 11/22/63 was picked up by historians. It was picked up by readers of historical fiction. It was picked up by those people, those so-called people who never read Stephen King. They were drawn to this because it's a different kind of book, and it required a tremendous amount of research. And I don't know, if you read a lot of Stephen King interviews, or you've heard him talk about his writing, or read about him write about his writing, he says that he doesn't like to outline. He likes to go in sort of blind and just follow the inspiration, see where it takes him. He repeatedly makes comments like, why do you think I have any control over this? I'm just writing what I see. I'm just documenting what happens in the story, which is all well and good. And it has led to some sort of clunker books, and it's led to some masterpieces over the years. But 11/22/63 is a completely different kind of beast, because all of these details, like for the first time, Stephen King is writing explicitly about something that actually happened. He's writing about people that actually lived, and their movements and what they did, what they said, their addresses, all of that are well documented. So he had to get all of those ducks in a row to be able to sufficiently tackle this subject. Because if he had gotten everything wrong, people would have ripped the book to shreds. So there was a very high bar, and it was a very different kind of writing process, which, knowing that full well, going into the book, which I listened to on audio just a couple years ago, for the first time. So it had existed for many years before I finally took the plunge. And, with all the research that was involved, the supposed so-called like lack of creativity in having to hew so closely to established fact, I wondered if what would be left for Stephen King. Would he have had to adhere so much to an outline basically of history that he would lose the ability to interject a really thrilling and vital story into the mix? And I was absolutely delighted to find that that is not the case. They're not unlike Titanic. I keep referencing Titanic in my videos, but in a way, the comparison is appropriate here because, there is that historically documented aspect to the work. So what's coming, what's going to happen. I mean, you don't know how it's going to turn out, but the ending, or, the climactic scenes in the book are not really in doubt from the get-go before you even start. But outside and on top of and around and underneath this historical narrative is a very compelling love story. There's aspects of time traveling, daring do and romance, and some things that are drawn completely from Stephen King's own memory of living in the period, but aren't, you can't. He talks about the way things smell. He talks about the way things taste. And you can't go back and say, no, that's not true. Things didn't smell that way. Things didn't taste that way. A lot of the book is full of those little details that are drawn from Stephen King's own memory and own imagination. So he has the historical narrative and the timeline, but gives himself lots and lots of room to sort of move around and add his own flavor. One thing that I was completely not expecting, that I sort of knew the basic premise, the basic concept. One thing I was definitely not expecting was the fan service in the book that ties into some very familiar characters from another epic Stephen King book, which I won't go into all the details. If you've read 11/22/63, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, hopefully it will come as a nice surprise to you as well. But there's a whole sub-narrative that takes place before the main narrative, where the main character in the book is trying to determine just because he doesn't want to get it wrong. If he goes back and tries to interfere or intervene in the Kennedy assassination, he wants to make sure that he understands how it actually works, or if it works. So he goes back once before the main narrative kicks into play to try to test things out and see how it goes. And that is where it ties into these other familiar characters, and in a very delightful way. And ultimately, the most interesting thing about 11/22/63 is that the Kennedy assassination is of course the purpose of the book, but it is kind of ultimately beside the point. Like in Titanic, you remember the ship sinking, but what lingers after the movie is over in the months and years following is the love story between Jack and Rose. Well, 11/22/63 kind of achieves the same type of thing. So there's that. It is just a carnival, a fantasy world of what ifs and speculation, which definitely speaks to the conspiracy theorist in all of us. The what if this hadn't happened? Stephen King did some research. He talked to some very educated people to get their perspectives on what if Kennedy had lived, what if the assassination had failed, and he draws some interesting conclusions from that as well. So I think when I've done ranking videos, ranking the decades, and what stands out to me as I'm doing the listings of the books for each decade is that overall the decades, there's some great stuff. There's usually some stinkers, or there's some mediocre things. And overall, the consistency decade to decade is not necessarily super high. But when thinking about the 2010s and making the list of all the books that Stephen King published in that decade, and of course including 11/22/63, I found that it is one of the very best decades of his entire career. The 70s, absolutely vital, unimpeachable, iconic, but it was only about 5 years, handful of books that he published. The 80s, probably the most iconic, but also there's some incredible variation in quality in the 80s. But the 2010s, he came roaring back. He hit a new stride in his writing and in his career. And 11/22/63 sort of exemplifies that, and gets the decade off with a bang. But anyway, I follow some other Stephen King bloggers and vloggers, and not everyone feels the same way that I do about 11/22/63. So let me know your perspective. Let me know your thoughts on the book. Is it overrated? Is it underrated? Did it have you on the edge of your seat, or were you like, oh my dear God, can we please get on with it? These are the reactions that I've heard from other people. So I'd be very curious to know your take on it. So let me know. But anyway, until next time, thank you very much for your support of the channel. I really appreciate it, and take care. I will talk to you later. Bye.